So thank everybody for joining us today, and just want to mention some of the upcoming programs, but before we talk about the program that's happening here. So April 11th, there's going to be the co-parenting in a pandemic and other ways to build resiliency in mediation. And June 13th, the title is Keeping Your Head in Mediation. And these are noontime programs. And if you go to the ACR Chicago website, it'll give you more information about registering. So today's speaker, we're really excited, is Felicia Staub. And she mediates for her own private practice called Empowered Communication and for the Sound Options Group, and is the Practicum Supervisor and in-house mediator for the Snohomish, did I say that right? Snohomish?
Yes, you did.
Dispute Resolution Center, which sounds like it must be like our Center for Conflict Resolution here in Washington. She's on the board of directors of the Washington Mediation Association and created and coordinates their Mediators Café, a monthly gathering of Washington Mediation Association mediators for continuing education and networking, which sounds like a really cool idea. And she has won awards from the Washington Mediation Association, Whatcom DRC, and from the Freedom Project, and has had mediation articles published in mediate.com. Is there anything else, Felicia, you want to add?
No, that was plenty.
Okay. We're really excited for you to be here. I think this is going to go till like 1:30 for people. And if you have questions, put them in the chat, and then I'll let Felicia know we have them. So it's all yours.
All right, thank you. Just to answer something you said in my introduction, in Washington, each county has a dispute resolution center. It's kind of the center of mediation for each county, but they're all nonprofits. And in addition to that, we also have private mediators with their own practices. So I do both. Okay, well, welcome. Thanks for coming today. The topic that we're talking about today came out of a mediation that I did a couple months ago. This was a mediation that had, it was between a divorced couple. They'd been divorced a long time. They had kids and they had a parenting plan, and they actually had healed pretty well from their divorce. Their communication between each other was actually really good. They had good respect for each other, and things in general were going well until they came upon the issue of the COVID vaccine. And they had very polarized opinions about whether or not to vaccinate their children against COVID. And despite the fact that they'd made lots of decisions together before and communicated well together, they just could not figure that issue out. And so they came to mediation. So when we mediated with them, we did our usual thing of doing our introduction and hearing their opening statements and reflecting back and trying to figure out what was important to them, all the things that we normally do in mediation. And then when they began negotiating together, they couldn't get anywhere. Really not too much of a surprise. That issue, it just was, they each had their opinion they were dead set on. They weren't going to change their opinion, and they weren't able to convince the other. So it wasn't going anywhere. Very quickly, it wasn't going anywhere. And so I just kind of had this brainstorm in the middle of this mediation. And so I asked them a question. If you have, a really difficult decision you have to make, how do you make it? If you're not sure which direction you want to go, and things are really, there's a lot of conflict about it, how do you go about making a decision like that? And so I started asking them some questions to figure out not the decision itself, but their process for how to make a decision. And that's kind of what led to this. So we ended up guiding them through figuring out a process for how to make their decision. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Oh, I guess I could share my screen. I have a little PowerPoint that will guide me throughout. So thanks for your patience while I juggle things around here.
Recording.
Okay, so we got an echo there. So this is the question. What can you do when you have your mediation parties, they have a very difficult decision they have to make and they can't find agreement on? Have you experienced this in mediations you've done, a really polarized topic? Nobody?
Yes.
Okay, well, I certainly have had a few, and so I'll be describing some of those examples as we went on. The COVID vaccine was only one of the issues that I've done that were really polarized. Let me give you another example of one. Let's see. We'll go along. I'll bring up examples as we go. So do you think that what's going on in our country, things are very, very polarized about a lot of things in our country right now. So do you think that affects parties and how they are when they come to mediation, the issues they're discussing and the way they're able to come to decisions or not? Do you think the hyperpolarized climate we have is affecting people's lives and their decision making and their conflicts? And how?
Well, I think people are in some of the work that I do, there's a guardedness that, people may have been guarded even before COVID, but with COVID, with the political climate, with, just interpersonal, losing a job, insecurity, family members dying, there's just so much that people can absorb. It's been expressed to me that just people can't take one more thing. So they're, more closed in, shutting down, just, I just can't deal with the things. It might be, one response to what we've been going through.
Yeah, that's, and I agree. I'm seeing that as well. People, one of the things I'm seeing is that people are just more dug into their positions than they were before, maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I guess I've been doing this for a while, so I'm showing my age in this field, but people seem to be a lot more dug in and a lot less willing to consider other opinions and to flex on their possibilities for solutions. That's one of the things that I'm seeing. Thyanda, did you have something you wanted to say? Forgive me if I've mispronounced you.
Nope, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. It highlighted you looked like you were speaking. Okay, so one of the first things I look at when we're talking about decision making is how do you make decisions in your own life, in your own relationships? How do you do it?
Sort of look at the Thomas Kilmann conflict modes test, and that depending on, which I think is interesting, they say if you take the test to decide how you deal with conflict, you should think of one scenario that you're in, because you may deal with it differently at work than you deal with friends and things like that. But I think I tend to accommodate, I think, if people know that. So I don't know, it really depends on who I have the conflict with in terms of how I deal with it.
And yeah, I would say that's definitely true. I know that's true for me, that I behave differently in decision making depending on who it's with and what the specific topic is. There are certain situations that I also use accommodation, like if I have a supervisor who wants me to do something and I don't want to do it, I generally accommodate because they're the supervisor and I want to keep my job. And the same was true with my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law has, she passed away quite a while ago, but I would go with what she wanted because it was more, the relationship was more important to me than the decision was in that specific issue. But there are situations when I use quite a different style than that, like when I was parenting my son. He's a grown up now, but when he was little, I think I was probably a lot more of a director, a competitor. telling him what to do. And of course, that changed a little as he got older and took more decision-making responsibility himself. But there's lots of different ways that couples make decisions together. And here are some examples of what I can think of. For some couples, maybe one of them makes the decisions, all the decisions, and the other goes with it, which would be more like a directive or a competitive style. For some other couples, they discuss everything and have to come to agreement on it, which is more like consensus, which is also in the conflict styles, more like a collaborative style where they have to talk about it together and come to agreement together. There are also some other variations on how people make decisions together. One that I can think of might be like not necessarily similar to a traditional conflict style, but maybe depending upon the issue. So say you have a couple who one parent is the primary caregiver of the children and the other parent is the primary wage earner. Maybe the primary caregiver of the children makes all the decisions related to the children, and maybe the wage earner makes all the decisions related to the finances. So there, there's lots of variations for how couples make their decisions together. I'm sure there are lots of other ways than those three examples that I just gave. In my relationship, we generally try to discuss something and come to agreement together, but it doesn't always work, perfectly. There was the time that I can think of is where an issue like this about how we make the decision came up was when we were going to buy a house. So when we wanted to buy a house, we started looking and we looked at lots of houses, and he would like one and I couldn't stand it. I would like one and he didn't like that one. And so we struggled with this for a while, looked at lots of different places. And then we decided, well, I think it might be important for us to figure out what are our criteria, what are the factors that are important to us in a house. And so we narrowed it down to, not really narrowed it down. There were a whole bunch of different factors in what we were interested in buying a house. And so one of them was the neighborhood that the house was in, the distance from work, so how far we would have to commute. Was there garden space? That was something that was important for me because I always have a garden. What was the condition of the house? What was the crime rate of the area? What were there trees and plentiful water? We live in a desert, and so having trees, having shade in the summer is really important, and there being good plentiful water access is really important when you live in the desert. And of course, also then the price of the house and the seclusion of it. Those were important, all things that were important to us. We're people that live in the country. And so we did not want a house that's, house upon house. We like to live someplace that it's hard to see neighbors. And so when we were coming to our decision about the house, we came up with this list of what all the factors were, and then we prioritized them. And really, actually, most of what was important to one of us was important to both of us, but it helped us narrow down our focus. And from there, once we had the focus of, what was the top priority and what were the next ones, then we were pretty easily able to decide upon which house we were going to buy. And so we did, and we're still here. So that's how we made a difficult decision that had a lot of different factors going into it. So I want to start us off with a little exercise. And let's see, I gotta find the screen to pull up. And this exercise is going to be just to get us thinking about criteria for how you make a decision. So we're going to talk about just an example. If you're part of a couple and you have, or not necessarily a couple, but two people making a decision together, you have a car together and your car died. And so then you need to buy a new car. How do you decide what car to get? What criteria do you use? So for this, what I want us to do is just brainstorm what criteria you use when figuring out how to buy a car. And I'm going to list them on this sheet, and then we'll look at that. So what criteria do you use for buying a car?
Price.
Price,
Gas consumption.
gas consumption? What else?
How big does it need to be? In terms of seating?
Size in terms of seating,
Reliability.
reliability.
I have to be able to put a bike inside and a bike on top, or load it up with stuff on top and be able to strap it down. So those, whatever those things are, you rope stuff to on the top of the car.
Some of the
Yeah,
chat says reliability, insurance costs, state and city
insurance
permits,
cost,
crash safety.
crash safety.
Cost, cost of maintenance.
Maintenance cost. What else?
The color,
Yeah, the color, how about the, just, the looks of it? Anything else? That's plenty. Those are a lot of different things you look at when you're looking at buying a car. So now I want to kind of look at each of those and what's the interest underlying each of those criteria, each of those factors. So what's the interest underneath the price of a car?
can you afford it? Can you afford the monthly payments? Is it gonna stretch you? What if you have to, put maintenance
Affordability.
into it?
Financials. Gas consumption, what's an interest underneath the gas consumption?
Price, cost, miles per gallon.
So environmental concerns.
Yes, thank you, that's what I was going for. Environmental concerns about the gas consumption. What's an interest behind the size and the seating in the car?
Being able to accommodate the family.
Yeah, accommodate the family.
And functionality kind of broadly, like drive other people, stick your bike in the back, all of those things.
Oh, definitely. Functionality. And what about reliability? What's the interest under there?
Security.
Being-
Somebody
Is
said
it gonna-
security, is that what I heard?
Yeah.
And
Is it gonna-
yes, go ahead, Michael.
Is it going to be in the shop every 6 weeks?
And so if you're concerned about it being in the shop, what's the interest underneath that? Would that be
Cost. It's cost.
it's cost,
It's
and
convenient.
also
too.
transportation, just being able to have transportation that works, right?
Could be,
Somebody else said something. Go ahead.
related to-
The time spent taking it to the garage, waiting at the garage, having to take it back if they don't fix it, dealing with the shop mechanics.
Convenience.
Was it made in the United States by union labor?
That I think is another factor there, made in the US by union labor.
Could also be fear that you have a long way to drive for work and it's a deserted area and you don't want to break down where there's nobody around.
So I would call that the fear is the emotion you have around safety concerns. The issue is actually, the interest is actually safety. And when you have room for a bike, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Security also, not just safety, but your own security.
Yes, indeed. And I do have that in there. Your security is definitely important. What about room for a bike? What's the interest important in there?
Being able to load up, go camping, put a canoe on top, have space for everything that you need to get out of town. Escape,
So convenience, functionality,
adventure,
entertainment. What's that?
adventure,
Adventure. Also exercise,
exercise.
right?
But also you
So
need
that's
it to be
a health
reliable, again, because you don't want to break down in the middle of the desert in Arizona.
No, indeed you would not, because you might find yourself stuck in a desert without water. The desert where I live it's definitely desert, but it's not quite as bad as that. You wouldn't have to go too far to find something to drink. Okay, what about insurance cost? What is your interest underneath that? I might say it's financial interests. Anything else that anyone thinks is important in insurance cost? What about crash safety? Well, the interest is right there in that one. The interest of crash safety is safety.
Well,
And maintenance
airbags on all
costs.
sides of the car. The airbags in
Yes.
the back seat, airbags in the front, on the sides of the car. Anti-lock brakes,
All of that
four-wheel drive.
would be factors that tell you whether or not it's going to be safe in a crash. And as far as maintenance cost, I guess I can probably stop going through this. We've got a lot of interests here, and some of them are repeated for different factors. But basically, in doing this, I wanted to get you to look at what are the factors one considers when making a decision, and what are the interests that are fueling those factors, what's important underneath them. Any other thoughts on this? Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing that. Okay. So when we're working in mediation, though we might not be mediating a topic like what's the next car you're going to get, we are going to help guide the parties through how they're going to make a decision. And so, it's a similar process where you got to figure out what the criteria are and what's important to you within those criteria. How are you going to make the decision? So let's talk a little bit about types of decision making. Let me see where I can find it now. Here we go. Next one. Okay, so when you have groups making decisions, there's a number of different ways that people make decisions together. And I'm going to go through them briefly. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on it, but a little bit, just so you're thinking about this and how people make decisions together. One type of decision making is hierarchical decision making. There's some other names for that. They could be called unilateral decision making, or autocratic, or dictatorial. For hierarchical decision making, one person makes the decision. It could be a boss or a dictator if it's a government. It could be a teacher in a classroom. It could be a parent in a family. One person has all the power. What type of situations do you think might use this type of decision making, hierarchical decision making?
Well, families do. The
Some
parents
families
make
do.
decisions for the children.
Yes, that is very often the case. What other situation do you think might use hierarchical decision making?
In the workplace.
And so in the workplace, it's usually the supervisor or the boss or the director or something like that.
CFO, yeah.
Say that again?
The CEO, CFO.
Yes, CEO, CFO. Yep. They usually make the decisions in a hierarchical manner or an autocratic manner. What about the government? Is that a situation is that a group that usually uses hierarchical type decisions? I guess it depends on the system of government that the country has. So if you have a government that's got a king that makes all the decisions, that would be a hierarchical decision making. Some governments have one person calling all the shots. Some governments like ours are not quite hierarchical because we don't have a hierarchical. We have a president, but we also have the other groups, the Senate and the Congress. So ours is going to be the next form, the democratic decision making. In democratic decision making, there's majority voting. And each of these types of decision-making has advantages and disadvantages, right? So with hierarchical decision-making, it can be quick and decisive. One person makes the decision, and that's an advantage, is that it's quick and decisive. A disadvantage is that everybody else was not part of that, making that decision, so they may not be happy with it. With democratic decision-making, when you have majority voting, if a majority is 51%, when you make a vote, 95% of people might vote for one thing, in which case 95% are happy and 5% are not happy with the decision. But it also could be 51% have voted for a particular issue and 49% have voted not for that issue. So that might be quite a lot of people who are unhappy with the decision. That's a disadvantage of democratic voting. There are no in-betweens. There's two choices and there's nothing in between it. However, democratic voting, an advantage of it is that everybody gets a voice in, one way or another. And also that it's pretty quick. You have an issue, you take a vote, and that's that. What type of situations would use this type of decision-making? Besides our country, which we know our country uses democratic voting. Can you think of any other? What was that?
Nonprofit boards or organizations.
Sure, nonprofit organizations sometimes use this type of decision-making.
Groups of friends.
Groups of friends. Yes, the person who has the phone number, you said something, but I couldn't tell what it was.
It's families.
Families sometimes use democratic decision-making. And then another type of decision-making is consulting. So in this case, when a decision is made by consulting, the people who are the decision makers, and it could be one decision maker or a group of decision makers, they have a process where they have to consult with others before making the decision. So they do this by gathering information and then they evaluate it. The information that they gather can be from experts. It can be, they may consult a representative population, or they may consult just anyone who has an opinion on it. So using consulting as a process for decision-making is a little slower than the two we just went through, hierarchical and democratic, but it's a process where you gather information. So maybe it's a little informed of a decision-making process. What types of situations might use this type of process? Can you think of any examples of that?
I don't know if this is what you would, oh, go on, sorry.
In workplace situations, the issue is that in a consulting situation, you have responsibility but no authority, responsibility for gathering the information, but no authority for making final decisions.
That could be the case. In some businesses, they'll have a process like that where they have a decision they have to make and they have a process for gathering information, consulting others. So business partners who, it's not one person calling the shots, but it's several and they have to work together. They may use a process like this. Another example I can think of is when someone is being evaluated for addiction. They may have to go through some evaluations and then some counseling and this and that, and all of these people get together to decide what's the appropriate course of treatment for this person. So that goes via a consulting process as well. Cookie, I think you had a thought as well.
Well, we just had a mediation in our office this morning where parents agreed if there was going to be a medical decision to be made, and they disagreed, that they would go to a physician or an expert in the field. I think that's a sort of consulting way.
Yes, indeed. And in fact, back to my couple with the COVID vaccine, that's one of the things that they decided was that they wanted to consult with some others to get some expert opinions. The person with the phone number, can you tell me your name so I don't keep calling you the person with the phone number?
person with the phone number. That's my name. I'm joking. It's Yvonne.
Yvonne, did you have something you wanted to say?
No, I was just listening. Thanks for asking.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so that's consulting decision, using consulting as a decision-making method. Another example where people would use consulting as a decision-making method might be a couple who are going through divorce and doing a property division. So I've seen it in which they have to consult with an accountant to figure out some aspects of their finances, that they have to consult with maybe a tax attorney. They have to gather information from experts like that in order to be able to make their decision. And then another type of decision making is consensus decision making. And so with consensus decision making, the issues are discussed and discussed and discussed until you come to a place where everybody agrees. The advantage of this is that you don't make a decision until everyone agrees, which means that everyone is invested in the decision and nobody ends up feeling left out of the decision or that they don't agree with it. The disadvantage of consensus process is that it's very time consuming. I used to be part of an intentional community where every decision we made was decided by consensus, and it was very time consuming, but ultimately, we did that because we wanted everybody to be supportive of the decisions that we made. When you have consensus process, most of the consensus process that I have run into, there's usually several options for when you come to a vote on something. You can either agree to it, or you can stand aside, or you can block. And what those choices are is if you stand aside, that would be someone saying, well, I don't agree with this choice, but it's not that important to me that I'm willing to stop the whole thing. Maybe it's not my choice, but I think it won't be detrimental to the group as a whole. Blocking is the other choice, in which case the person disagrees, but they think that it would be detrimental to the group as a whole. So they're willing to stop everything. This cannot go forward. I won't, it won't get past me. And so one of the faults of this type of decision making is that if somebody blocks, that means that one person's decision or opinion trumps all the rest of the people. So that can end up causing some problems. And as a result of that, some groups have come up with some variations on this to try and prevent one person making a decision for all by blocking. So some of the variations that I've seen are consensus -1 or consensus -2 or something like that. And that's an attempt to not have one person hijack the decisions for themselves. But consensus decision making, again, is the attempt to have everybody's needs met and everybody invested in the decision. What types of situations do you think might use this type of decision making?
Jury duty.
What was that?
Jury duty.
Jury duty. Yes, you're right. Jury duty is definitely consensus process. And that's a difficult one. It was on the jury that I was on when I was on one once. Thank you. That's a really interesting. I'm gonna have to think on that more, but that is definitely consensus decision making. Any other thoughts on types
School
of
boards are often consensus, not always.
School boards do?
Sometimes.
I haven't been involved in a school board, so that's interesting. I've also been involved in some of the organizations I've worked for over the course of my career. We had one, it had a director, it had the normal hierarchical structure, but we made decisions in our staff meetings by consensus. It can be used in, different situations. And then the last type of decision making that I have down here is avoidance. And what is avoidance? It's not making the decision. So if there's a decision to be made and maybe you decide instead of fighting about it, we're just going to put it off. And that is a choice in itself. It's not making a decision on the issue, but it's making a choice. And an interesting thing about avoidance as a decision-making method is that If one person is avoiding, and this goes back to the conflict styles that you brought up earlier, Cookie. If one person is avoiding and it's a decision that it's necessary to have everybody's input on, one person avoiding actually can stop the whole thing, which means it can be kind of a surprising way of controlling the decision. Somebody who's saying it's, we're not going to, I'm not going to do it, but therefore nobody gets to make the decision. It can be a way of controlling it. What types of situations do you think would use avoidance as their decision-making method? One example I can
I
think
think
of.
family.
Sometimes families you avoid just so that they avoid the conflict. Is that what you're thinking?
Right.
Yeah.
And children avoid requests or directives or avoid making decisions. They have a lot of power that way.
Yes, it's interesting how it can be a power move for sure. Another situation in which avoidance is used is maybe if the decision just is not that important to that person, the person who's avoiding, maybe they don't care. And so sometimes if their input is required for the decision, it can stop the process. But sometimes they can say, I don't care, make the decision without me. And that could work too.
I've had some task forces that have had some difficult characters, and those characters that do like to throw out Robert's rules to derail everybody, because nobody is an expert with Robert rules except this particular person. So it has been used just to like move forward, leave it alone, get together at another time because of this disruption of this particular person, particularly around Robert's rules.
Yeah, that is a good example.
What was that?
Yeah, that is a good example. A community group where they use Robert's Rules of Order, and it's an avoidance technique because they stop everything because, you got to follow Robert's Rules of Order, non-negotiable. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I would think that when that somewhere along the way they had decided this is the method we're going to use. We're going to use Robert's rules, and maybe they let that go if the discussion is going well and they're able to figure it out. But when it's not, they say let's revert back to Robert's rules.
Right.
Okay, so let's go to the next part. The next part is about which type of decision making do you choose? And so there's this looks to me a little bit similar to, actually quite a bit similar to the conflict styles, just the way this is laid out. But there's a couple of factors in which choice of decision making method you use. So is it an individual or a group that's making the decision? Is the decision, do you have a lot of time to make it, or not very much time? It needs to be made very quickly. So if you have one individual is making the decision and you don't have a lot of time, that would be the hierarchical method where one person makes the decision. And then if you have one person is making the decision, but it's not critical that the decision happen right away, maybe avoidance would be the method. Well, let's put this off and deal with it later. If you have a group making the decision and there's a lot of time that you can use to make a decision, that's when consensus process might be appropriate. And if you have a group making decision and you don't have a lot of time, you need to make it fast, democratic process would be a little better. You take a vote and that's it, you're done. And then I put consultative kind of in the middle of all of that, because consultative can be made by an individual making a decision or a group making decision, and it can go a little faster or slower depending on what's needed at the time. But that's just kind of lays out how you make a decision depending on the size, the number of people making it, and the speed the decision needs to be made. So what method do you use? This is, I don't know that people necessarily usually think about this. This is kind of, I don't know if it's innate, but it's close to innate for how we make decisions. You identify the problem, you figure out what the objectives are that you need for a solution. Then you look for alternatives. What are the various choices that we have? And then you evaluate the alternatives. And when you evaluate the alternatives, that's how you narrow it down until you can be able to pick one. And so once you choose an alternative, then you implement it, but you're not done there. Just because you chose a decision and you implemented it, you shouldn't consider yourself done, because at that point you need to monitor the outcome. You need to figure out how it worked. Did this work? Did this achieve what we wanted it to? And if it did achieve what you wanted it to, you're good. But maybe it didn't, and maybe the outcome was not what you wanted, in which case you go through and do it again, choose a different alternative and start again. And let's see, I had some other things I wanted to say about that. In the monitoring part of it, this is where your communication is really important. So, you know, if you just make a decision and then you go about your way and you don't ever talk about it again, you know, who knows what will happen? Will it have worked out well or not? So it's important to communicate about it afterwards. You can't assume that it's going to be a final decision. With monitoring, you have the opportunity to communicate, the opportunity to reassess and adjust your method, your decision-making method. So that when you have decisions to make for the future, you can adjust and see, well, what worked well and how are we going to do this next time? So what do you do if mediation parties are coming to a decision and it seems like they won't be able to follow through? What do you do if it seems like it's kind of doomed for failure? Let me give you an example. So I do a lot of eviction prevention cases. Mediations, we have that going on in our state, where a lot of people ran into trouble in the pandemic with being able to pay their rent. And there was a government mandate, the governor had a mandate that said that people couldn't be evicted during the pandemic for lack of payment of rent. Now that the pandemic has eased and people are starting to get back to work again, there's still this issue of all this unpaid rent for months and sometimes 2.5 years. And so the landlords, of course, they have their mortgages to pay as well. So it's an issue for both of them. So in our state, they've created a mediation program to have the landlords and the tenants sit down and figure out what they're going to do with this back balance, the rent arrears that haven't been paid during the pandemic. So I do a lot of those kinds of cases. And if people have gotten back to work and they're able to catch up, they make an agreement, and that's great. But I've also seen situations where people are not back to work, and yet they're perfectly willing to make an agreement and sign an agreement saying that they're going to pay, you know, their ongoing rent plus an extra amount each month to chip away at that back balance. So if, you know, someone does that and that they want to agree to anything, it kind of seeming to me like they want to come to this agreement just to stop the eviction process and get the landlord off their back for a little while longer, I would start asking some questions. What do you do if someone doesn't hold up their end of the agreement? I look for contingency plans, you know, so what happened, you know, you don't have a job right now to be able to make that payment. So how are you going to make that a payment? What are you going to do if you can't make that payment? So you create those contingency plans, the what ifs, and you put them in the agreement. And so you might the person might say, well, I might be able to get financial assistance, rent assistance that'll help me with this, or I'm expecting to get help from a family member, but I haven't got it nailed down yet. But you write all those things, all those contingency plans into the agreement. And that's another part of how we help build it for success, so that even if what they're agreeing to doesn't work out, there's something to fall back on. Okay, so now I want to talk about, go ahead.
You talked about,
Yvonne.
you began this by talking about interest. So, what is the interest? What interest do people have? What do they expect to gain from it? So in the situation that you just talked about, where you've got somebody who is sitting down in a mediation, and their goal is just to stop the eviction. They're interested in just stopping the eviction. They're not interested in actually catching up with the arrearage. So how does that figure into the contingency plan that you would develop?
So how it would figure into a contingency plan for me would be if we write, well, what happens if this tenant doesn't make the payments that they agreed to, and it can be something as simple as the landlord can then proceed with eviction. That can be one of the contingency plans for what ifs. Or it can be that then we agree that there will be, if he misses 2 payments, then the tenant will move out, and it'll be, under these conditions with this time frame, and et cetera. When will the keys be returned? All of those kinds of things. So those are some contingencies that they might come to. Might be a move out plan, might be eviction. When with the tenant, what you were mentioning just now about the interest of the tenant in signing that agreement when they can't really live up to it, I would say my guess would be that the person's interest there is keeping a roof over their head, having a home. But it might be others. This is a made up situation. I made up this scenario. In most of those eviction cases that I have done, the vast majority of the tenants have not paid their rent because they got sick with COVID or they lost their job. The vast majority of them are people who genuinely had financial difficulties, and most of them are really genuinely trying to work this out and figure it out. But there are always a few who are trying to get what they can out of it. And the same is true of the landlords. Some of the landlords are compassionate about the situation that their tenants were in, and some of them don't care. Give me my money, and that's it. People really vary.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
Sure do. Okay, so let's go to another one. So going back to the original scenario that I told you, this mediation I did with a couple about the COVID vaccine. So we worked with them on how they were going to make the decision. And so we created kind of like a decision tree, which is what this looks like to me. The first thing we look at is what their interests are. Talk to the parties about what's important to each of them. Do they have common interests? And with this pair, the interests, as I said, were the safety and protection of their children. There were some other interests as well. One of them one of the parents had her parents living in the home with her, and they had health conditions which would have made it very, very dangerous if they got COVID. So her interest was not just the safety and protection of the children, but also the safety and protection of her parents. The other person, that wasn't as important to him because that situation didn't exist in his household. But the two of them did have the common interests of the safety and protection of their children. And so starting from that footing, they're completely in agreement on that. We just have to figure out how to get there, how to get to the choice that's safest for their children. So we talked to them. I asked them questions to kind of bring out all of their decision-making criteria. And for them, the first one we talked about was, what are acceptable sources of information? So some examples of sources of information might be government agencies. In this case, they were looking at information from the CDC. Other sources of information might be peer-reviewed journals. And an example of that would be like the Journal of the American Medical Association, studies that they have published about the issue under discussion. Other examples might be information people find on YouTube or from talk shows or from friends. And you can see that there's, you know, in the examples that I've given there, there's pretty variable level of information there in terms of how much study has been done and what the basis has been for the conclusions that are drawn. So for this couple, they decided that the acceptable sources of information for them were the CDC and the WHO, World Health Organization. People like that were the sources of information that they chose as acceptable for them. Then they were going to do their own little survey of research studies to find what research has been done on the effect of the vaccine, the side effects of the vaccine. How much does it actually prevent you getting COVID? You know, all of these different factors. They were going to look into research studies on that. And so then they discussed what's important in a research study is for them, they wanted their research studies that they looked at to have verifiable data and non-cherry pick data. So verifiable data, what that means is, I'll explain that by an example. So there's the CDC has a database of side effects on the COVID vaccine. It's called the VAERS database, VAERS. And that database is a place where people can report their side effects from the COVID vaccine. However, it's anybody can report it, and there's like there's no necessary correlation between, like, are you sure this side effect you have is actually from the vaccine, or could it be could it have been caused by something else? So it's not verified. No doctor has looked at it and said, yes, this is a true effect, one thing causing another. It's unverified data. So they agreed that they could only look at data that had been verified. And as far as cherry picked, if you have data, like say you have 100 people who have been given the vaccine, and if you look at all 100 of them, that's complete. You look at the whole sample. But if you look at the 100 people who have been given vaccine and you choose, well, we're only going to look at these 5 who had horrible side effects, that's cherry picked. They're choosing to focus just on a small group. Or you look at the opposite. We're only going to look at these other 5 who had no side effects. That's cherry picked data, and it does not give you a complete picture. So for that couple I was working with, it was important to them that the data not be cherry picked. Excuse me. There was something else I wanted to say about studies. Oh yeah. So when you're looking at if you have to do some research to find information about an issue like making decision about the COVID vaccine, there's a lot of different types of studies that you can look at. Some examples would be studies that are peer-reviewed versus not peer-reviewed, experiments that are controlled and randomized, or there can be case studies, which case studies just looks at one person's experience of what happened. So that's kind of anecdotal. There are also correlational studies. Those are studies that tell you there's a relationship between 2 or more things, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what the cause and effect was. So there's kind of, you have to be careful about what conclusions you draw from correlational studies. And then another type of study is longitudinal studies, which that takes a group of people and follows them over a long time to see what the effects are, not just short-term effects, but long-term effects. So those are some different types of studies that people might look at when they're looking at data and research studies, and trying to figure out what the research says. So another thing this couple decided about that they would use and how to make the decision was what experts they were going to consult. When you're looking at experts, there's some differences in the type of experts. Is this someone they're going to speak to personally, or is this someone who a recording of them speaking or an article or that they published? What type of experts are acceptable to each of them to consult? And for this pair, they agreed that the expert they wanted to consult was their children's pediatrician. And they both agreed that they would accept the word of their pediatrician, whatever the advice was of their doctor. And then finally, they needed to divvy up who was going to do what, the timeline and the tasks. So who was going to look at research, the research studies, who was going to look at which source of information, how are they going to report back to each other, when was all this information gathering going to happen, and then when were they going to get together and look at it all and decide. And then once they made a choice, how would they monitor the outcome of the decision, and what contingency plan would they have in case the decision didn't work out. So that's what this pair that I worked with, this was the decision-making process they came up with. Was, I guess it's sort of a consultative process to gather information from others and then come back and evaluate it and figure out what was the plan.
Felicia, did you still want to do small groups or?
Yes, I do, and that's coming here shortly. Any questions about this before I stop sharing my slide here?
I have one quick question. I was just wondering, how long was your mediation session, and was this, like, did you get back together with them? Did you set this up like in an hour and then you never saw them again? Did this take place over several days, 2 hours?
It was one mediation, which took about 3 hours.
So they were able to take a break, go get the information and consult, and then come back and then digest the information they found?
No, we just created the process of decision-making together in 3 hours. And then they created a timeline. They were going to have, I think they gave themselves like a month and a half, 2 months, something like that, to gather all of the information and the data and get back together and decide. So I have not seen them since then. I don't know what happened. But it seemed to me that they laid out their path pretty clearly. So once they gathered the data, it seemed to me that it would be obvious what the decision was, one way or another. Okay,
thanks.
Another interesting thing that went into this mediation for me was that I had a co-mediator, and both of us had very strong opinions on this particular topic of the COVID vaccine. And so my co-mediator and I had the same opinion. And so we knew that we were going to agree with one of the parties and not with the other. And yet we had to still be perfectly neutral with that party and not express our opinions, not show our opinions on our faces. And so in thinking about it beforehand, that was something my co-mediator and I talked about and figured out how we were going to do it. So when we have a mediation, we'll have one of us reflect back to one party and other reflect back to the other party. And sometimes we'll decide upon who's going to reflect back who. It might be by gender, or it might be the order of who speaks, or some other factor. In this case, we decided that we weren't going to choose who reflects back who based on their opinion, because we both were going to agree with one and not with the other. So we just did it by order. So I got to reflect back. I ended up getting to reflect back the parent who had the opposite opinion to mine. And I was a little nervous about that initially, because I didn't want my opinion to show on my face. And I managed it. Just like with all mediations, our neutrality is absolutely critical. And I've come to a place where I've learned that my opinion just doesn't matter here. It doesn't matter if I have an opinion, it's just irrelevant. And so I'm listening to the party, not because I have a care for for the issue myself, but because I want to know what's important to them, and I want to help them understand each other. And so thankfully, I think I was able to do that with this very polarized issue and not have my opinion leak out on my face. So that's certainly a challenge. Okay, go ahead.
But Mark Mayer is going to be co-host. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Who's Mark? Let me see who that is. Oh, there you are. Hi, Mark. You're muted.
Hi, thank you.
Okay.
You're welcome. Okay, so when we helped guide these parties through this very, very polarized decision, the way we got there with them was by asking a lot of open-ended questions. So I just kind of want to throw it out to you. What questions might you ask parties to help them figure out how they're going to make a decision? Well, I'll start you out with some of the ones that we asked. You know, the first one was, what criteria do you use to make a decision? Another interesting one that I think is good when you're working with couples is, how did you make decisions together when you were a strong couple? Can that process work now? You know, at some point they were a couple, right? And so at some point they hopefully were able to make decisions together. Now that they're not a couple, can they still decide in the same way or not? But that's basically what we did, was we used open-ended questions to guide them through figuring out not necessarily the decision, but how they were going to make the decision. And so with a case like this, even if they don't make the decision about that topic right then in that day when you're mediating with them, they will have created a process where they can do that in the future, and they will have created a process that will lead to them being more informed about the topic. This can only help. Even if they can't make a decision, they'll be better informed about it. Another situation that I think this might be useful for, besides just decision making, would be something like ground rules for communication. So I don't know, when you mediate, I don't know if you discuss ground rules for how they're going to communicate with each other in the beginning. Most of the time, I don't. We have an agreement to mediate that talks about things like no inflammatory language, that, you know, no pushing each other's buttons, that kind of thing, no interrupting. But aside from those things in the agreement to mediate, we don't discuss necessarily the ground rules for communication. But if you have parties who have very difficult communication between them, you might be able to use a similar process to this to create the ground rules for how they're going to communicate with each other. Okay, so now I have an exercise that I want to do. I want you all to do. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you out to breakout rooms in shortly here. And I'm going to give you 2 scenarios to do. And I'm going to split you into groups of 3 or 4 people. I'm not sure exactly how many people we have. 4 times 8, 9, 10, 11 people, something like that. And so groups of 3. And you will discuss these scenarios. I'm going to post them in the chat. And I want you to look at these scenarios and just think about, what are the interests operating for the people in these scenarios, and how would they come to a decision? It'll be 10 minutes for each of these scenarios.